We all love the NBA trade deadline. It's one of the biggest draws to NBA fandom for a lot of people, figuring out how all these pieces are going to fit, how the league values guys on other teams. It's why the trade deadline gets so much coverage. But what about those trades that were discussed and almost happened? My name is Tucker. Thank you for clicking on the video, by the way. I really appreciate it. So first up on the list is by far the most ridiculous entry. So the Dallas Mavericks obviously wanted to shake up their roster at the deadline. They made the Kristaps Porzingis trade, who we'll talk about later. And Jalen Brunson was someone that was discussed to a lot of different teams. It's a weird circumstance around him where he's clearly a very good player. He fits well alongside Luka. He's one of the true setup backcourt guys in the league that isn't a score first guard. And he's an unrestricted free agent this offseason despite only being in the league for a couple years, and there's some real doubts about Dallas's ability to retain him in the offseason, so it was clear they were shopping him. And so reportedly, one of the teams that would be interested in Jalen Brunson was the Detroit Pistons, and they called Dallas and said, hey, we like Jalen Brunson, what are you looking to get out of him? And Dallas turned around and said, what about Cade Cunningham? Can you imagine being the person on the phone in Detroit and saying, excuse me, you asked for what? There's zero scenario in which Cade Cunningham would ever be involved in a real trade discussion in exchange for Jalen Brunson, but this is clearly the most crazy, most ridiculous rumor of the whole deadline. Theoretically, I can understand why Detroit asked for Brunson in the first place, not in exchange for Cunningham, but as a player that could play alongside him, allow Cunningham to be on or off the ball on any given possession, the spacing that Brunson provides. Certainly he's a better fit alongside Cunningham than someone like Killian Hayes. And I'm kind of surprised that Dallas didn't take those discussions further, potentially in exchange for a player like Jeremy Grant, in addition to the Porzingis move, all of which I think would have really helped their team. And as a bonus, Grant is on a multi-year contract after this season. I don't know that Detroit would have parted with Grant unless Brunson would have already agreed to an extension. It would be difficult to trade a player that valuable for a guy that's unrestricted, but I couldn't make this video and not include that rumor. Next up now, let's talk about the Lakers. We all know that this has not been a good year for LA, specifically as it relates to the Russell Westbrook trade. They made it in the offseason. A lot of people thought it was a mistake, including myself, and it has gone as poorly as it possibly could have. And it was clear, at least based on reports, that LA was at least exploring the idea of moving Westbrook to a different team. They understood that their options were limited, but one option that continually came up was Westbrook in exchange for John Wall. And as a move, it's incredibly interesting because Wall and Westbrook aren't incredibly different as players, but if Wall can be a better perimeter spacer than Westbrook, which isn't too big of a stretch and is presumably very, very healthy and very, very fresh, considering the fact that he hasn't played all year, it could have potentially made the Lakers a better team. But reportedly, those discussions only went so far as Houston requesting draft compensation in addition to Russell Westbrook in exchange for John Wall, because they had no intention of keeping Westbrook on the roster. They were just going to buy him out. And I guess the understanding there would be that it would be easier to get a buyout out of Westbrook than it would be from Wall, either because Wall doesn't want a buyout or for some reason Houston doesn't want to buy him out. But obviously the incentive there would be to get the future draft compensation. Now, personally, I think it would have been hilarious if the Lakers had made this move and moved Westbrook before he even finished a full season in LA, and they gave up a pick to get back a player in John Wall that I'm not convinced actually makes them better. The only scenario in which it would is if Wall really locked in defensively and became a good off-ball spacer, both of which I think are a huge stretch. But in terms of deals that almost happened or were heavily discussed, I think this one would have been incredibly interesting if it went down. Next up now is my favorite trade rumor from the entire video, because it's clear that this was heavily discussed. Kristaps Porzingis ends up going to Washington. It was clear that Dallas wasn't super optimistic about their ability to move Porzingis, considering his contract, considering some of the health concerns that he has in the short as well as in the long term. But they were able to move him to Washington, basically just splitting his salary in half. Spencer Dinwiddie and Davis Bertans are going to help Dallas, maybe not more than Kristaps Porzingis would have, but it's easier to move each of those contracts individually down the line than trying to move Porzingis as one gigantic contract, and that's mostly the reason why they made the move. However, there was reportedly one other serious suitor for Porzingis, and that was the Toronto Raptors. There was some rumor swirling even leading up to the actual deadline at 3 o'clock on Thursday about a Dragic, Porzingis, and some other stuff swap, which felt like a strange rumor at the time before we found out about Porzingis being shipped to Washington, because it felt like he would have had more value than that. But essentially it would have come down to Porzingis in exchange for Goran Dragic, who's on a big expiring contract, some other salary filler there to get them to KP's salary number, and a first round pick in there somewhere. I don't know if Toronto was going to give a first. I don't know if Dallas was going to give a first. It seemed like Toronto would, maybe, considering the fact that they traded their first to San Antonio anyway in exchange for Thad Young. It seemed like they were pretty committed to moving a first round pick. And for Dallas, it would just be getting a pick, getting Dragic, and getting out of the salary of Porzingis. That's where his value ended up. And how far these discussions went is a really interesting indicator of where the value of Kristaps Porzingis in a trade really falls right now around the league. And by the way, if that's all it would have taken for Toronto was Dragic, a first, and some salary filler, none of which are helping them on the basketball court this season, Porzingis, if he's healthy, would have made Toronto an even more interesting team as we approach the playoffs. They're playing really well. They're really locked in defensively. They just don't have a ton of front court depth outside of Siakam and a little bit of Boucher. And if you could do like Siakam, Porzingis with all their wings in Van Vliet, that's a really interesting group. As always, it depends on Porzingis' ability to stay on the floor, and we've done the whole like what if thing with Porzingis for like 5 years now in terms of if he can stay healthy, but still, I think this trade is even more interesting than what ended up happening for Washington. Now, what it came down to for Toronto is that they just didn't want to deal with the long-term health stuff. Porzingis, it scared them off. They didn't think that he was going to be someone that was going to be able to stay healthy. But I'm going to be thinking about this one for a little while. What if Porzingis would have ended up in Toronto? Circling back now to the Lakers for our next rumor, and this is potentially even funnier than the first one. Supposedly, the Lakers were exploring trade options involving sending Russell Westbrook to Sacramento in exchange for Buddy Hield. That's right, the player that they almost traded most of the Russ package for on draft night to Sacramento in exchange for Buddy Hield. That's a deal they almost made then, and then they tried to turn around and reverse it at this deadline. It's just so funny because there were a lot of people, including myself, that at the time they made the Russ trade were saying that they should have just taken the Buddy Hield package, which I believe was Kuzma, Harrell, and a first. In exchange for Buddy Hield, they still would have had KCP. There's some combination there that they would have ended up keeping at least one of the guys they sent to Washington in exchange for Russ, not to mention the fact that Hield would have been a better fit than Russ. And it's just absolutely hilarious that they tried to make that work then a second time before Sacramento ultimately sent Hield to Indiana as part of the Tyrese Halliburton trade, which is a whole different conversation. This is another one that I wish we could have seen. I wish this one could have happened because it would have been absolutely out of control for a complete 180 for Russ, for the Lakers. I don't know what Russ's future in Sacramento would have been. Would they have bought him out? Would he suddenly be a buyout player? Because obviously they have plenty of guards. Would they have kept him? I don't know what would have happened. And ultimately, Sacramento is the team that turned this deal down after the Lakers tried to explore the option. And then last up, this one, I honestly couldn't believe it when I read it, but I actually can believe it because it's Phoenix. There were conversations had between Phoenix and Indiana about a Deandre Ayton Domantas Sabonis swap. Now, the way the report reads, it was an into the future thing. It was like an exploratory, how would this look thing? And some of you are probably wondering, what in the world is going on here? So quick context. Deandre Ayton is a restricted free agent this offseason, and he has not been offered the full max by Phoenix. Phoenix is a team that just doesn't really want to pay a ton of money for their team. They already have an expensive group between big contracts for Devin Booker, Chris Paul, Mikal Bridges. A couple of other guys on the roster have relatively significant contracts as well. And Deandre Ayton, quite frankly, is worth the rookie max, at least relative to all these other guys like De'Aaron Fox that have signed these big contracts. Deandre Ayton is certainly worth that in terms of value to Phoenix. But there's questions about whether or not they're actually going to follow through on that or the possibility of sign and trading him this offseason. I think it's a real thing. And so supposedly Phoenix and Indiana, prior to Sabonis being moved to Sacramento, had exploratory conversations about what a Sabonis-Ayton trade would look like if Indiana kept Sabonis past the deadline and then they explored that conversation in the offseason. That is a mind-blowing thing to even think about because of Ayton's fit alongside Miles Turner. It doesn't exist. So then they'd have to move on from Turner. And then no disrespect to Sabonis, but Ayton is perfect for what Phoenix needs as a defender, as a switchable guy, as a bigger player than Sabonis. I can't even wrap my mind around what that trade would look like if it did end up happening in the offseason. Now, ultimately, Sabonis obviously ends up in Sacramento, and I highly, highly doubt that Phoenix, who's been the best team in the league from start to finish this year, actually fully considered making this move now. I can't believe that would have been the case. It would have been an off-season thing, but the fact that this conversation even took place, which has been reported multiple places, blows my mind. And yeah, those are some of my favorite trade rumors from the deadline. Hope you enjoyed it. Once again, my name is Tucker, and I will see you all next time.